All right, Janet, do you want to introduce the next presenters?
Sure, yeah. Meyru, I believe you're up next. So Meyru Bhanti is here. She's from the Winrock International. It's a nonprofit here in DC. They do a lot of work around tropical forests and conservation. She's going to present about mapping stable and intact forests around the world. Thanks, Meyru.
Yeah, of course. Thank you all for having me. I did try to put some slides together, but they never quite came across. So I'm just going to talk, and I hope it doesn't get too boring. I'll be brief. The work that I'm going to be talking about is ongoing research, so I don't have any cool results to show. The slides that I put together didn't have a single map that I had made, which I realized was either a big GIS taboo or some kind of record, and I thought best to go away with the slides altogether. So the project is being funded by the World Bank, and as I said, it's under review right now. And the premise is was presented by a paper by Jason Funk. It's titled "Securing the Climate Benefits of Stable Forests," and I'll pop it in the chat. It's a good read and presents. I guess I would say presents. It's already established, but provides a good argument for why stable forests should be delineated. And so the team that I work with at Winrock is the ecosystem services team. So while I support the geospatial side of things, there are also economists and policy experts that are focusing on creating mechanisms to protect forests that might be excluded from REDD programs or other programs that really highlight reducing deforestation. So our objective is to identify those forests that are not under threat of deforestation. So the definition of stable forest presented by Funk is that those forests not already significantly disturbed nor facing predictable near future risks of anthropogenic disturbance. So as an ecologist in my roots, when I think of stable forests, I think ecologically stable or stable for biodiversity reasons. And the intact forest landscape product that you might be familiar with really takes into consideration intactness in the context of biodiversity. The patch size restriction that they use has to do with viability for charismatic megafauna. And so our definition of stable forest differs in that we don't have any patch requirement. And we also aren't really looking at connectivity between forests. And so what we're really looking at is where has deforestation occurred and where is it likely to occur in the future. And my thesis advisor for my master's during my defense asked me to distill my entire research into one word. And so if I were to do that for this project, I would say distance. If you gave me 3 words, I'd say distance from edge. And so it's been well documented that deforestation is really driven by accessibility to humans. And so we are using distance metrics and looking at where within which distance from edge historic deforestation has occurred, and then using that as a metric to understand where we might expect future deforestation to occur, in the sense that if they give you the example of the Andes, where it's more mountainous, it might be, even if forest is close to the edge, it might be more difficult to deforest, whereas a more accessible area, even close to the edge would be easier to deforest. And then we also are taking into account the human pressures and the dynamics of the forest conservation policies in the given country. So I'll give the example of Sweden, which has very strict forest conservation might be the wrong word, because they do a lot of forest management, but they have really strict laws. And so forest, even up close to a township, might actually be quite well protected and not under threat of deforestation, whereas a forest in, I'll use the example of India, might be at more risk close to the edge because of different policies. And so we have used a lot of existing global data sets and tried to synthesize them and identifying stable forests globally and then within case studies. I think at the case study level, things are much more interesting because at the case study level, we are also breaking down the carbon and non-carbon benefits of these stable forests and trying to assess the stock protected within stable forests. And then also we're able to look at the net primary productivity and trends in net primary productivity to identify stable forests that are producing well. So that hopefully is somewhat interesting. I recommend the paper, and yes, that's one of many things we're doing at Winrock. And it's connected to oceans because we are also taking into account hydrological benefits of stable forests. It's a bit tricky to do at the global scale, but we have been able to do it at the case study level. And I think the work we're doing is interesting, and it could certainly be built upon, as all things could be. And sometimes when we do GIS, we have great ideas, and then it all comes down to a very simple principle, such as distance to edge. But there it is.
Thanks, Meyru. So you didn't really specify, but which kind of imagery are you using? And are you, I guess you're processing everything on the cloud. What are the technological sides of it? You know, I'm sure it's a lot of processing going on there. So maybe you have a little comment about that.
Of course. So we're actually using all secondary products at this point. So the Hansen data set is the baseline, but we did do our processing on Google Earth Engine at the beginning of things, but then I found the distance module, this is recorded forever, I found it difficult to use. And so we're not using any imagery. The net primary productivity product is from Modis, but it's not any first level remote sensing.
Have you found anything kind of interesting come out of your case studies yet?
I think it's been interesting to see. I had my doubts about the deforestation occurring at different distances from edge in different countries and seeing any significant trend there per country, but we actually have. So that's been somewhat interesting.
Cool. I'm sure there are lots of other questions, but I'm just wondering, when you say deforestation from edge, are you talking about deforestation within the forest, within the core forest away from the edge, or away from the edge in the disturbed areas? Are you doing that?
I understand what you mean. So the way that we've defined stable forest is in each year, you would basically define stable forest as forest that is X kilometers from the edge of forest. So in a country such as Gabon, where deforestation has 90% of deforestation has occurred within 1 kilometer of the edge of forest, we then apply that backwards. And so stable forests are those forests that are within 1 kilometer from the edge of forest. And then we are using the human footprint layer by Ventnor, updated with some road maps to identify the human pressure in those areas. And then I don't know exactly the threshold we used in Gabon, but then we apply a human pressure threshold to further eliminate areas. And so when I talk about historic deforestation, that would be the distance from the edge of forest in 2000. For no magical reason other than data availability.
Quick question from me. So did you say that your work is leading to a public data product, or is this internal or for a specific customer? I'm just wondering if there's, what's the outcome and if people can access it?
Oh yes, for sure. So right now it's a report for the World Bank. And it's, I believe, the first step in the World Bank's, we're kind of creating the framework to incorporate stable forests into their existing policies. I mentioned there was an economic and policy output. And so there will be a written report available to the public, but it's going to be going under peer review first. Yep, and published by the World Bank.
Are there any other questions for Emily?
I have a question. How small can an area be and still be considered a forest worth studying?
Yeah, so there are different national definitions of forest, and so they would include the minimum. And it sort of depends on the context in which you're thinking about stability. So when I first approached this, I was thinking about the context of biodiversity. And so in that case, you would select a certain species and say what patch does this species need. I think it's interesting, and haven't had the opportunity to dig into it yet, but I think it's interesting to think that in the face of drought or the face of a big storm, what is the minimum forest patch size that will be able to be resilient to those events? So you can really think about it in whichever context you would like.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat too. Do you have a hypothesis for what would be the minimal size for a stable forest patch? Tens of kilometers, smaller, larger?
It's a pop out, but I would say it depends on what context you're looking at. Obviously, if you're thinking about the hydrological cycling or the contribution of forests to rain, then you would be thinking much larger, really large patches. If you're thinking of the context of elk, you would need large patches. But if you're thinking about an area that's stable to pest outbreak, you would also need a large patch. Really, you would often need a large patch. I bet some mice would be content in smaller patches.
I heard in the near the end of your presentation, you mentioned that stable forests can also impact hydrologic response. How would a stable forest versus an unstable forest affect the hydrology? Like, does it contribute to flashiness, or what kinds of behaviors were you looking at?
Yeah, so we were doing a pretty high level investigation and really assessing the value of stable forests based on the populations downstream and the drought status of different sub-watersheds. But there is a climate data set that we didn't use that that might be relevant to your question that I'll have in the chat. I don't know if that answered your question, Tim, but hope it did.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? I have one more.
Thank you. Oh yeah, Jen.
You mentioned the intact forest product that is available on the GFW website, I believe, coming from University of Maryland. So what is the difference between your Winrock product and this one that exists? You did mention, I'm not sure if I caught that.
No worries. This is where PowerPoint probably would have helped, but I would say that the Winrock is more of what we are recommending is less of a product and more of an approach, because at the case study level, you get the most interesting assessments of stable forests based on the national definition of forest, but then also the specific dynamics of deforestation that are not necessarily spatially explicit, but based on the national policies and such. And so our product our approach differs from intact forest landscapes because we're not eliminating forests as being stable because of patch size. And we're not looking at other forested landscapes, we're looking at traditional forests.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.